So if your body wants to rotate to the left, to counteract that, you're engaging the external obliques on the left side and the internal obliques on the right side. So that's a ton of work you're getting done from what seems like a relatively simple movement. There's a lot more than just working on balance in these positions. You're getting a ton of work through 3 planes of motion. Alright, today just going over 4 different terms that are pretty common in fitness, and a lot of people have probably seen them before. I think there's a lot of confusion about what exactly each one of these is. So I'll give a few examples of each one and then kind of break down why you would do each of these things. So the 4 terms are bilateral, unilateral, contralateral, and ipsilateral. Bilateral and unilateral, those are the easiest ones to start with. Bilateral is just referring to both of your limbs. So an example of that would be doing bicep curls with both arms or doing squats with both legs. So bilateral kind of makes sense, bi meaning two limbs doing a movement, whether it's the arms or the legs. Given that, unilateral should also make sense. Unilateral is just doing something with one limb. So using the bicep curl as the example, it would just be a bicep curl with one arm. Using the squat as an example, it would be doing a squat with one leg. So the benefit of bilateral movements, since you're using both limbs, we'll just stay with a squat for that example, you're gonna be able to load a lot more because you're on 2 limbs. So I'm assuming that most people can back squat more weight with both legs than they can on a single leg. So the benefit of bilateral movements is increased loading. That's going to help with building strength. Unilateral movements are a little bit different. There's a lot to dig into when it comes to unilateral movements, and the last 2 terms, they're both unilateral. So ipsilateral and contralateral, those are both unilateral movements. So for now, I'll just skip the explanation of like the benefits and why you do unilateral movements, and I'll just dig into why you do contralateral movements and why you do ipsilateral movements. So starting with contralateral movements, if you think of contra as like contrasting, it's opposite sides. So an example of that would be a single leg, single arm Romanian deadlift. In this case, since it's contralateral, if you're standing on the right leg, the load will be into the left arm. So using opposites, right leg, you hinge yourself over, left arm goes down, and then you come back up. So you're loading into the right leg while the weight is in the left arm. Then you can also sort of stack movements on top of each other, where you can be doing a unilateral movement on the lower body and a bilateral movement on the upper body. An example of that would be, we'll just go back to the Romanian deadlift, 2 kettlebells this time, loading into the right leg, so unilateral on the lower body, bilateral, the upper body, hinge yourself over. So the Romanian deadlift is unilateral, and then you're doing a supinated row in the bottom. That's a bilateral movement. And then you stand yourself back up. Coming up out of that deadlift is again unilateral for the lower body. Another example of contralateral movement would be standing on the right leg and doing an overhead press with the left arm. Left leg would be up in this case, and then you just press up and then back down. Then ipsilateral, as you would probably guess, is doing those movements on the same side. In the case of the Romanian deadlift, if you're standing on the right leg, the weight or the load is going to be in the right arm. Same thing, hinging over, but now I'm just loaded all through the right side. Same thing with that overhead press. Here we go. Standing on the right leg, right arm has the weight, press up overhead. Again, the loading is just through the right side. All right, so why do we do unilateral movements? Regardless of whether it's ipsilateral or contralateral, when you're working on just using a single limb, you tend to be able to get a greater range of motion and better activation of the muscles that you're trying to hit. That's a result of the load generally being less than you would be using if you were doing a bilateral movement. So less load allows clients to usually work on form, technique, positioning, and kind of focusing exactly on what they want to be targeting. So another benefit is balance, but in which way are you working balance? So I made a video about the 3 planes of movement. Just very quickly, as a refresher, if I were in a very narrow hallway, anything that I can do in this hallway, forward and back, presses overhead, hinging, squatting, anything I can do in that hallway, that's all going to be in the sagittal plane, lunging forward. The frontal plane, I'll do it from the side. If the hallway were now this way, kind of a wall behind my back and a wall right in front of me, whatever I can do side to side, wide grip overhead press, those are all done in the frontal plane. Transverse plane, anything that's done, if you were just imagine a sheet of glass, kind of like cutting my body off, anything that would be parallel to that sheet of glass. So a lot of rotational movements, bench press, so my body would be horizontal, I'd still be working in that transverse plane. For the most part, if people think about rotational movements, that's going to be the transverse plane. So given all that, why do contralateral and ipsilateral movements? So I'll just use a single arm, single leg overhead press. We'll start with contralateral, which is standing on the right, pressing with the left. Once I'm here, so I'm going to be pressing up overhead. This is my sagittal plane, so I'm still in that narrow hallway. So I'm working in one plane of motion, but what am I resisting? Since the weight is on this side, it wants to pull my body to the side in the frontal plane. So you're resisting the movement through the frontal plane. So the other thing that happens when I'm up here is my body wants to rotate. So that's the third plane, that rotation through the transverse plane. So in that example, you get to work in the sagittal plane while your body is resisting movement through the frontal plane, and it's also resisting movement through the transverse plane. So you're actually working all three planes of motion through one movement. So going a little bit further, what exactly is happening in each plane? So here, standing on one leg, so your glute is engaged on the right. From here, overhead pressing, so you're using your shoulders and triceps. Then the weight wants to pull you to the side in the frontal plane, so you need to use the opposite lateral flexors of the torso to engage to keep you from falling over, and then you're also resisting that rotation in the transverse plane. So if your body wants to rotate to the left, to counteract that, you're engaging the external obliques on the left side and the internal obliques on the right side. So that's a ton of work you're getting done from what seems like a relatively simple movement. There's a lot more than just working on balance in these positions. You're getting a ton of work through three planes of motion. And the big thing with contralateral movements is that it's both sides of the body that are resisting the movement through those other two planes of motion. So I'm working in the sagittal plane. Your body on both sides is resisting movement through the frontal plane and through the transverse plane. Ipsilateral movements are working just on one side of the body. So again, the example of the overhead press, right arm is pressing overhead and you're standing on the right leg. Same thing happens up here. So the weight's still gonna wanna pull me to the outside. So I'm still using the lateral flexors of the torso to keep myself upright and resisting the movement through the frontal plane. And I still wanna rotate to this side because that's where the weight is. So you're still using the internal, external obliques. Ipsilateral movements are just a little bit more demanding in the plane of motion that you think you're actually working, the plane that you're actually moving through. So in this case, you're moving through the sagittal plane. So the resistance, so the work that your body has to do to resist the frontal and the rotational, the transverse plane movement, that's going to be roughly the same in contralateral or ipsilateral movements. If you were to think about the sagittal plane as the working plane, you're going to get a little bit more work done because it's more demanding on that one side of the body when you have the weight and the stability leg on that same side. All right, so quick recap: bilateral, using both limbs; unilateral, using just one limb, whether it's an arm or a leg; contralateral and ipsilateral, those are both under the umbrella of unilateral movements. Contralateral, think contrast opposites, and then ipsilateral, think same side. So hopefully that helped clear things up, but I realized that was a really long-winded explanation, so you might actually be more confused than when we started.